but that the states were really important in terms of the operation of our government. Now, in our current situation, do the states get a whole lot of credit or autonomy to do much of anything? No. The federal government's kind of swamping the boat. But that's not what was contemplated back here. And that's led a lot of commentators to say the 9th and 10th Amendment have pretty much been forgotten. And there's been a lot more interest in recent years in the 9th and 10th Amendment to say, wait a minute, if we expect to turn the ship of state around, we got to pay attention to something that dates back to 1791. And this is important stuff. I quote here from Joseph Story, who we've made references at different times to his commentaries on the Constitution. But here he reinforces the idea that the government of the United States is one of limited powers, and no authority exists beyond the prescribed limits marked out in the instrument itself. Now, if you go to Washington, D.C. these days and say, you know, we really think the federal power doesn't extend any further than what's written in the Constitution, that's going to be a tough conversation with most people. Right?
So I have a question about when did that kind of change? Because I know I certainly didn't ever get that story in school, in my history classes, about the state. I mean,
You
I
didn't
heard
study
about
the 9th
states,
and
right?
10th and 11th
Well, I'm
Amendments?
saying, I just, you know, I grew up thinking there was the federal government. I knew there was state, but it seemed much lower. So when did that tide turn from there being this emphasis on the states to being the emphasis on the federal government?
That's a good question. John, do you have a...
War between the states.
You think it was?
That's the short answer.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the Civil War, what was the stated reason that South Carolina said, we're out of here?
States rats.
States rats. Yeah, that's right.
Well, there was a struggle over the Constitution.
Right.
You know, the Southern statesmen recognized that the North had abandoned that covenant and broken it. And they were trying to retain those constitutional things, and they even improved a couple things and threw in a couple more safeguards, like defunding the post office after 2 more years, things like that, that were in the direction that the Constitution was by the best men.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, what happened when the Civil War wound down? You had Reconstruction, right? Which is Congress saying, okay, this is how we're going to rebuild the South. And by the way, there are certain things the South can and can't do. And by the way, there's a whole bunch of additional work that needs to be done with respect to the former slaves. So we're going to pass a bunch of civil rights legislation. And oh, by the way, and oh, by the way, and oh, by the way, where did all that emanate from? Washington, D.C. And so even though there's kind of been shifting balances at different times between the power of the federal government and the state government, I think John's right. Really, the Civil War was kind of the dividing line. And, you know, that was kind of natural at the time. Okay, we had a bunch of renegades who decided they didn't want to be part of the United States anymore. We beat them. Now we got to make sure they don't cut and run again. So let's make sure they don't. I mean, that's sort of...
Yeah, and there were other things. I mean, think about the impact of things like the federal income tax, and therefore the ability to directly tax. 1913. You have the popular election of senators, which came along about the same time. So the senators were no longer representatives of the states; they were representatives of people in the states. So, you know, I mean, that really was a big change in terms of giving the states a say, really, in the federal government when they lost senators as their state representatives, if you will. And then, of course, with FDR and the whole Social Security program, those were all.
Tie into it too,
I mean, they're all end runs, if you will, around the state, from the federal government to the individual.
Yeah.
Well, and even what we talked about with the interstate commerce stuff, you know, in the 30s and all of that, I mean, it all basically reflects a progressive but finally effective
Right.
federal power grab. John?
I know we won't have time to probably get to the 14th Amendment and all that, but I think one of the challenges there were Lincoln says, we're not going to let you guys become states again until you ratify this 14th Amendment. The problem is you couldn't ratify the 14th Amendment without a two-thirds majority of the states, which they couldn't get until these guys were states. So they were stuck. There's no way to have the Constitution and have the 14th Amendment at the same time.
Right. Okay. Now, once again, speaking of the 10th Amendment, Federalist 39 is one of the kind of key Federalist papers talking about this concept of federalism. And even though it predates the 10th Amendment, they were close enough in time that obviously some of the same thoughts were driving it. But if you look through this, you notice over and over again that it isn't the people acting as individuals, but they're part of the states that they belong to. And so the states are contemplated to be an important part of the whole balance of government. That's how you kept the federal government in check, was by giving significant power to the states and to the people. Okay? You all getting the drift of how far we've gone down the road here?
Yeah.
Yeah, Lorena?
I don't know if this fits in here, but Lee was given a command in the Civil War. They wanted him to work for the North, and he refused on the basis, at least in part, that he wanted to honor his state. And I couldn't imagine somebody saying, well, you know, I'm not going to go work for Utah because I'm an Oregonian. We don't have that kind of identity probably as strongly as he was purported to have not accepted the position, the military position in the North, and rather to work for the state, which happened to oppose. And I think he as an individual might have seen either side of the case, but because his state felt otherwise, he went with what his state wanted. That's my understanding of that.
I've been thinking about this for a while. You remember our Worldview conference, how it told us how we were going from more of a group society to more of an individually focused society. I see this as more of a product of that. Is the farther and farther we got along down that road of we are individuals, the less and less it was I am part of the state. It's I am an individual, therefore I need to be the one voting, not me as part of the state. So,
My next door neighbors happen to be rabid U of O fans. They have season tickets to watch. So every Saturday during football season, they put out their Oregon flag. Well, 365 days a year, I fly the American flag. So I kid them. I say, you know, you guys are Oregonians, but I'm an American. And I kind of needle them a little bit about that. But if you want to get really serious about it, I'm kind of thinking more, they're sort of more federalists, and I'm not. Well, you don't want to take that example too far, obviously. But anyway, now what's one area where the concept of states really still matters? I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with elections. Yeah, the Electoral College.
I was going to say traffic tickets, but
So, I mean, we still pay it, you know, whoever wins the popular vote in a particular state, the idea is that the electors from that state generally go as a block, and they are supposed to represent the decision of that state.